Cowboy argued with a giant Apache at dusk, and the promise Apache demanded shifted their bond. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main characters. Jake Thompson, a seasoned cowboy, lived alone in a remote valley nestled in the rugged wilderness of the American West. His ranch was a solitary place, surrounded by nothing but the vast expanse of the desert and the distant mountains. For years, Jake had chosen to live away from society, haunted by the memories of a past that he couldn't shake. He had no need for the company of others. The only thing that mattered to him was the land beneath his boots, the cattle, and the quiet solitude that came with the wide open spaces. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with fiery oranges and purples, something was about to disrupt the calm of his life. He was out near the edge of his property when he saw her. Helena. She stood tall and proud, her figure outlined against the fading light, her presence as commanding as the mountains behind her. Helena was no ordinary woman. She was Apache, a descendant of the fierce warriors who had roamed these lands long before any white man had set foot on them. Her dark eyes glowed with an intensity that sent a chill down Jake's spine. There was something about her, something he couldn't place, that made him both nervous and intrigued. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was only silence between them. Jake knew that the Apache tribe had been fiercely protective of their land, and he had heard the stories about the giant woman who had led them through battles and hardships. But he never thought he would meet her face to face. Helena's gaze was unwavering. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice calm but with an edge that made Jake's heart beat faster. "This land is not yours to claim." Jake stood his ground, his boots firm against the dusty earth. "I have every right to be here," he replied, his voice steady despite the tension that crackled in the air. "I've worked this land for years. It's mine." Helena's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you can just take what belongs to others?" she asked, stepping closer. The distance between them seemed to shrink with each word. "I'm not here to steal from you," Jake said, though his own anger began to stir. "But I'm not leaving either." The air grew heavier, the weight of their words sinking in like the slow descent of the night. Helena's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "Then you leave me no choice," she said, her voice barely a whisper now. "You will face the consequences of your actions." Jake wasn't sure what she meant, but he wasn't about to back down. His life had been one of hard work, and he wasn't afraid of a challenge. But the promise she made lingered in his mind, like a storm on the horizon. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them in that moment. As Helena turned to leave, she cast one last look over her shoulder. "This isn't over," she said. "You will learn what happens when you challenge the Apache." Jake watched her disappear into the fading light, a sense of unease settling in his chest. He had no idea what had just been set into motion, but he was certain of one thing: the bond between them had already been forged, and it would change everything. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to take a turn that would force him to confront more than just his past. It would force him to face the strength of the Apache people and the promises made in the heat of a fierce encounter. Days passed since Jake Thompson and Helena's heated encounter, and the tension in the air seemed to grow with each passing moment. Jake went about his daily routine, but his mind kept drifting back to her, Helena, the giant Apache woman who had warned him, who had made that promise. Her words echoed in his head. "You will learn what happens when you challenge the Apache." Jake had been prepared to defend his land, to stand his ground, but he hadn't expected to feel the weight of that promise pressing down on him. He couldn't help but wonder what it meant, what was coming for him, and whether he was ready for it. As the sun dipped below the horizon once more, casting a golden hue across the plains, Jake found himself standing at the edge of his ranch, staring out at the vast emptiness before him. He had been alone for so long, finding solace in the quiet of the land. But now, something had shifted. His solitude was being threatened, not by any man, but by the presence of Nehemina, her people, and the bond they had unknowingly begun to form. The quiet was broken by the sound of hooves. Jake turned, his heart racing, as the first of the riders appeared. It wasn't a group, but just one man, an Apache warrior on horseback, riding slowly toward him. Jake's pulse quickened. He hadn't seen this warrior before, but the man's posture, the way he carried himself, told Jake everything he needed to know. He was part of Nehemina's tribe. The rider stopped a few feet away, his horse stamping the ground impatiently. The warrior's eyes locked onto Jake's with a quiet intensity, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "The chief's daughter sent me," the rider finally said, his voice calm but firm. Jake didn't know what to make of this. Nehemina had sent him? Why? "What does she want?" Jake asked, his voice low, his hand instinctively resting on the rifle slung across his back. The warrior's eyes didn't waver. "She said you would understand when the time came." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning that Jake couldn't quite grasp. But there was no mistaking the gravity in the warrior's tone. Nehemina's promise was beginning to take shape. Jake felt a tightness in his chest. "I don't understand," he said, though he knew he was lying. Deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning. "You will," the warrior replied, his expression unreadable. "You have a debt to settle." Before Jake could ask anything more, the warrior turned his horse and rode off, disappearing into the fading light of the evening. Jake stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. Nehemina had sent someone to him, but the purpose behind it was still unclear. One thing was certain, though, whatever this was, it was only the beginning. He had crossed paths with Nehemina once, and now he had to face whatever consequences awaited him. The quiet, peaceful life he had once known was slipping away, replaced by something much more complicated and far beyond his control. As Jake turned back toward the ranch house, he couldn't help but feel that the promise Nehemina had demanded was a bond he would never be able to break. Whatever it meant, whatever was to come, it was inevitable now. The Apache had made their mark on him, and the consequences were just beginning. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty for Jake Thompson. The encounter with Nehemina's warrior had left him restless, his mind consumed by questions he couldn't answer. What debt was he supposed to settle? What had Nehemina meant by that cryptic message? The quiet life he had once known was slipping away, replaced by something much more complicated. Each time he looked out over the vast, empty land surrounding his ranch, he felt a deep sense of unease, as if something was coming for him, something he couldn't stop. The Apache were no strangers to the land, but their presence in Jake's life was becoming harder to ignore. He found himself standing in the same spot where he had first seen Nehemina, staring out over the horizon, when the sound of hooves broke the silence. This time, it wasn't just one rider. It was a group, riding steadily toward him, their figures slowly coming into focus as they neared. The lead rider was familiar, the same warrior who had come to him days earlier. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, 4 more riders followed, their faces stoic, their eyes scanning the land with practiced precision. As they approached, Jake's heart quickened. He had a feeling he knew why they were here. The warrior leading the group stopped a few feet away from Jake, his eyes meeting Jake's with the same intensity as before. "The chief's daughter has sent us," the warrior said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Jake nodded, trying to remain calm, but inside, his mind raced. "Why now?" Jake asked, his voice steady, though he couldn't hide the curiosity that laced his words. The warrior's expression remained unchanged. "The time has come to fulfill the promise," he said simply. "Nehemina's people have waited long enough." Jake swallowed hard. The promise. He had made a promise, one he didn't fully understand, but one that seemed to tie him to Nehemina and her people. "What do you need from me?" he asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. The warrior dismounted and stepped forward, extending a small, weathered bundle wrapped in leather. "This is yours," the warrior said. It's time to honor what was given. Jake took the bundle, his fingers brushing the rough leather. He felt a weight in his chest, a sense of responsibility he hadn't anticipated. As he unwrapped the bundle, his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a small, intricately carved pendant, the same one Helena had worn around her neck the first time they met. It was familiar, yet foreign, a symbol of something deeper, something ancient. This is the bond, the warrior explained. The promise you made. The promise of protection, of understanding. Helena has called for it to be fulfilled. Jake's mind spun as the significance of the pendant settled over him. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of something much greater, something that tied him to Helena's people in a way he hadn't fully understood. What do you want me to do with it? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. You will take it to her, the warrior said. It is a symbol of your commitment. Only then will you understand the depth of your promise. Jake nodded slowly, though he still felt like a man stumbling in the dark. The warrior didn't offer any more words, simply remounted his horse, signaling to the others to follow. As the riders turned and began to move away, Jake stood there for a moment, the pendant heavy in his hand. He wasn't sure what was expected of him, but he knew one thing: his life was no longer just his own. The Apache had come for him, and the bond he had unknowingly forged with Helena was about to take him down a path he couldn't escape. Whatever lay ahead, Jake was ready to face it. He had made a promise, and now it was time to honor it. As the days passed, Jake found himself preparing for a journey he hadn't anticipated. The pendant, now resting heavily in his pocket, felt like a constant reminder of the promise he had made, a promise he still didn't fully understand but knew he couldn't break. He saddled his horse early one morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The air was cool, and the wind carried the scent of the desert, fresh after the night's chill. His mind was racing, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. He had to find Helena. He had to give her the pendant, and see what the promise would demand of him. As he rode out, the vast emptiness of the plains stretched before him, a lonely expanse that seemed to echo the quiet tension in his heart. The landscape, familiar and yet unfamiliar now, seemed to close in on him. He wasn't just riding toward Helena. He was riding towards something much bigger, something he couldn't control, no matter how hard he tried. He reached the edge of the Apache territory by late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky. The land was rugged, the earth rich with history and memory. He had heard stories of this land, tales of the Apache people and their deep connection to the earth, their unwavering strength and fierce loyalty. Jake couldn't help but wonder if he was ready for what lay ahead. He had faced many challenges in his life, working the ranch, surviving on his own, battling against the harshness of the land, but nothing had prepared him for this. As he approached a small village, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Helena, he saw movement in the distance. A group of Apache riders were returning from a hunt, their horses moving in synchronized rhythm. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He knew one of them, Helena. She was riding at the front, her tall figure unmistakable against the setting sun. His breath caught in his throat as their eyes met. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Helena didn't speak, but her gaze said everything. She had been waiting for him. Without a word, she dismounted and walked toward him, her presence commanding the space around her. Jake felt the weight of her gaze, but he didn't flinch. He had come for this moment, even if he wasn't entirely sure what it meant. She stopped in front of him, her eyes never leaving his. "You have it," she said simply. Her voice was calm but full of something deeper, something that Jake couldn't quite place. He nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out the pendant. He handed it to her without hesitation. Helena took it, her fingers brushing against his for a brief moment. The connection was immediate, and Jake felt something stir inside him, a shift he couldn't explain. Helena studied the pendant for a moment before looking back at Jake. "This is the bond," she said, her voice quieter now. "It is a symbol of your promise. But it is not just a symbol. It is a vow. Jake swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to say, but he knew that whatever came next, he was already in too deep. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. Nehemina's eyes softened for the briefest moment, and Jake saw something he hadn't expected: trust. "You will come with me," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "The time for your promise to be fulfilled is now. It is not just a matter of words, Jake. It is a matter of action." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Jake felt a shift in the very atmosphere around him. This was not just about a promise anymore. It was about proving something, about stepping into a new role, one he hadn't asked for but could no longer avoid. Nehemina turned and walked away, her footsteps sure and steady, her people following in her wake. Jake hesitated for a moment before following her, knowing that this journey, this bond between them, was just beginning. He had no idea where it would lead, but he was about to find out. The sun was setting behind them as they rode together into the unknown, and Jake realized that his life would never be the same again. The ride was long, and Jake could feel the weight of his decision pressing on his shoulders with each mile they traveled. Nehemina led the way, her figure steady and resolute as she guided her horse through the rough terrain. Jake followed behind, his thoughts a tangled mess, but his resolve slowly solidifying. He had come here for a reason, even if he couldn't fully understand what that reason was. He had made a promise, and he would honor it. The land around them was vast, untouched by the hands of men, wild and free in a way Jake had never known. The desert stretched endlessly before them, the sun beginning to dip low in the sky, casting an amber glow across the horizon. The wind had a bite to it, sweeping the dust in waves, and Jake felt the familiar pull of solitude once again. He had been alone for so long, but now, with Nehemina by his side, something had changed. As the evening approached, they reached a small camp nestled against a cluster of rocky outcroppings. The Apache riders who had accompanied Nehemina dismounted and began setting up a fire, their movements efficient and practiced. Nehemina turned to Jake as he dismounted from his horse, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "This is where the promise will be tested," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made Jake's heart beat a little faster. Jake nodded, though he still wasn't sure what she meant. He had known that this journey would lead him somewhere, but he had never imagined it would feel like this, like stepping into a different world altogether. Nehemina moved toward the fire, and Jake followed. The flickering flames cast long shadows across her face, and for the first time since meeting her, Jake saw something in her eyes that he couldn't quite place. It was a mixture of strength and something else, something vulnerable. Nehemina sat down on a flat stone near the fire, and Jake took a seat beside her, the heat from the flames warming his skin. "You've come far," she said, her voice softer now. "But there is more you must understand. The promise you made is not just a symbol. It is a responsibility. A duty to my people." Jake listened intently, his gaze fixed on her. He knew this moment was important, that the words she spoke would shape the path ahead. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low, but with a sense of urgency he hadn't expected. Nehemina's eyes locked onto his, and for a long moment there was only the crackling sound of the fire between them. "I want you to understand," she said, her voice steady. "This isn't just about you and me. It is about honoring the past, protecting the future. You must stand with us. Not just in words, but in action." Jake felt a shift in the air around them, a quiet tension building that seemed to come from the land itself. "I'm ready," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure if he believed his own words. Nehemina's gaze softened, and she nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for him to say that. "Good," she said. "Tomorrow, you will meet the council. You will stand before them, and you will prove your commitment." Jake's heart raced. The council? What did that mean? What did they expect of him? Nehemina didn't explain further, instead turning her attention to the fire as she sat in silence. Jake could feel the weight of the moment, the sense of inevitability hanging in the air. His life had changed, and the bond he had made with Helena was pulling him deeper into something that could not be undone. As the night wore on, the rest of the Apache riders gathered around the fire, sharing stories and songs of their people, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to echo through the land itself. Jake listened, not understanding the words, but feeling the power in the music, in the connection between the people and their land. The world around him felt vast, but in that moment, he felt small, connected to something much bigger than himself. Helena sat in quiet contemplation, her eyes distant, and Jake couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. He had come here as an outsider, a stranger in a foreign land, but now, as the firelight danced across her face, he felt like he was beginning to understand what had brought him here. This was not just about protecting land, or honoring promises. It was about something deeper, something that tied him to Helena and her people in a way he couldn't yet fully comprehend. As the fire crackled and the stars above began to shine brighter, Jake knew that his journey was far from over. It was just beginning. The morning came quietly, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and gold, as Jake prepared himself for the meeting with the Apache Council. Helena had said little since their conversation by the fire, but the weight of her words had not left him. Today, he would stand before her people, before the council, and prove that he was committed to the promise he had made. His heart raced with uncertainty, but he knew he had no choice. He was already too far along this path to turn back now. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Helena approached him, her presence as commanding as ever. She was dressed in the traditional garments of her people, her long black hair flowing freely around her shoulders. There was no trace of the vulnerability Jake had seen the night before. Instead, she wore a mask of determination. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady, though there was an undercurrent of something more, something deeper. Jake nodded, though his throat felt dry, his words barely a whisper. "I'm ready," he said, but even as he spoke, he wasn't sure if he truly believed it. Helena didn't reply, but her gaze softened for a moment. She led him through the camp, the sounds of the morning bustling around them, riders saddling horses, women preparing food, children running through the dust. It was a world Jake had never known, but as he walked beside Helena, he began to feel a part of it. The council was held in a small clearing near the center of the camp, a circle of stone benches arranged around a central fire pit. The Apache people gathered around, their faces serious, their eyes watching Jake with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. He felt a sense of being an outsider, but Helena's presence beside him steadied his nerves. As they reached the center of the circle, Helena turned to face Jake. "Stand here," she said softly, "and remember your promise." Jake did as she instructed, standing tall and firm in the center of the circle, feeling the weight of the eyes on him. The council members, a group of elders and warriors, sat around the fire pit, their expressions unreadable. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jake could feel his heart beating in his chest, louder than the sounds of the camp. Helena stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "This man, Jake Thompson, has come to us with a promise," she began. "A promise to stand with us, to honor the bond between our people and his." She paused, looking directly at Jake. "But a promise is only as strong as the man who makes it. Today, Jake will prove that he is worthy of the trust we are placing in him." The council members murmured among themselves there. Voices low but filled with an undeniable authority. Jake swallowed hard, the pressure mounting. He had no idea what was expected of him, but he knew he couldn't falter now. Helena turned back to the council, her voice unwavering. "Jake has already shown his willingness to help us. He has walked the path of honor, but it is not enough. He must prove his commitment, his loyalty, to our people." One of the elders, an older man with weathered skin and piercing eyes, stood up slowly. His gaze locked onto Jake, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. "What will you do, Cowboy?" the elder asked, his voice low but commanding. "Will you stand with us, or will you turn your back when we need you most?" Jake felt the weight of the question sink into his bones. This was it, the moment where everything changed. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. I will stand with you, he said, his voice stronger than he had expected. I gave my word, and I will keep it. The council members exchanged looks, as if weighing his words, before the elder nodded slowly. We will see, he said. We will see if your word holds true. The tension in the air was palpable as the elder returned to his seat. Helena gave Jake a small, approving nod before turning to face the council. Jake has made his choice, she said. It is time for him to prove his loyalty. Let the trial begin. Jake's stomach tightened. He had no idea what the trial would entail, but one thing was clear: this was no simple test. It was a challenge, one that would determine if he truly belonged here, if he was worthy of the promise he had made. As Helena stepped back, Jake took a moment to steel himself. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. The journey he had begun was far from over, and the true test of his commitment was just beginning. The council's eyes were upon Jake as the elder spoke, his words hanging in the air like a weight Jake could barely hold. Let the trial begin. The words echoed in the silent circle, and Jake could feel the heaviness of the moment pressing on his chest. Helena had said the time had come to prove his loyalty, but what did that truly mean? What kind of test would he face? The elders exchanged a few quiet words, then gestured for Jake to follow Helena. She led him away from the council, her posture unwavering, and the others watched in silence as they moved. As they reached a small clearing, Helena stopped and turned to face him. The trial, she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of something deeper. It is not just a matter of words, Jake. It is a matter of your heart. You must show us that you are willing to sacrifice, to protect us as you promised. Jake looked at her, still uncertain of what she meant. Sacrifice? He repeated, his voice low. Helena nodded. The Apache people have always believed that only through sacrifice can one truly understand loyalty. You will not face this trial with a weapon or a test of strength. You will face it with something far more difficult. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. What could be more difficult than strength, than standing before an enemy and fighting? What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Helena's eyes softened, and she took a step closer, her gaze searching his. You must face your past, Jake. You must confront the reason you have come here, the reason you made your promise. The words hit Jake like a punch. His past. He had left his past behind, buried it deep, wanting nothing more than to forget the things he had done, the mistakes he had made. But now, it seemed, his past had followed him, and he would have to face it in the most personal way imaginable. You will visit the place of your greatest regret, Helena said. You will go there and leave something behind. Only then will you prove your commitment. Jake's heart raced. The place of his greatest regret. It was a place he had vowed never to return to, a place where he had made decisions he could never undo. The weight of his past threatened to pull him under, but Helena's steady gaze anchored him. Do you understand? She asked, her voice soft but firm. Jake took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he nodded. I understand, he said, though he wasn't sure if he truly did. Helena gave him a small nod and stepped back. Then go. Show us who you truly are. Jake didn't wait for further instruction. He mounted his horse and rode away from the camp, heading toward the distant hills where his past lay buried. The journey was long, and with each passing mile, memories from his past rose to the surface, memories he had spent years trying to forget. As he neared the place, the familiar ache in his chest grew stronger, the weight of regret pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He reached the spot as the sun began to set, the sky turning shades of red and orange. The land around him was quiet, but it felt alive with the echoes of his past. The place where he had made his biggest mistake. The place where he had failed. Jake dismounted and walked slowly toward the spot, his mind racing with memories of that day. He could almost hear the voices, feel the weight of his decisions, the choices he had made that had brought him to this point. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and then knelt down. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the pendant that Helena had given him. this symbol of the promise he had made. Without a word, he placed it on the ground, leaving it there as a gesture of his commitment. He didn't know if it would be enough, but he knew that this was what he had to do. With one last look at the place that had haunted him for so long, Jake turned and walked away, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had left something behind, and in doing so, he had taken the first step toward understanding what it truly meant to be loyal. He wasn't sure what the next part of the trial would be, but he knew one thing for certain: he had changed. The promise he had made was no longer just words. It was a commitment, a bond that tied him to Helena and her people in a way he could never undo. As Jake made his way back to the camp, the weight of what he had just done lingered in his chest. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of purple and orange, but the beauty of it seemed distant, out of reach. He had left something behind, something important, but he wasn't sure what it meant for him. Or for Helena. The ride was long, and with each mile, his thoughts continued to swirl. What would the council think? What would Helena think? Would they see the act of leaving the pendant as a true sign of his commitment, or would it be just another empty gesture? As he approached the camp, the familiar sound of voices and the crackling of the fire welcomed him, but the feeling of uncertainty still hung in the air around him. He dismounted and walked toward the center of the camp, where Helena was waiting. She stood tall, her posture as steady and strong as always, but there was a glint in her eyes that told Jake she had been waiting for him. "You've returned," she said, her voice soft but filled with something deeper. "Did you do it?" Jake nodded, though his throat felt tight. "I did. I left it there, where it all started." Helena's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "And how do you feel?" she asked, her voice carrying an unexpected warmth. Jake paused for a moment, considering her question. "Lighter," he said slowly. "Like I've let go of something I've been carrying for a long time. But I still don't know if it's enough." Helena studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It is enough," she said. "You've proven your commitment. But the trial is not over yet. The bond between us, between you and my people, is still being forged." Jake felt his heart race at her words. "What do you mean?" "I've done what you asked." Helena took a step back, her eyes never leaving his. "The trial is not just about what you do for us, Jake. It is about what you are willing to give up, what you are willing to sacrifice. The bond is built not only on promises but on trust. And trust is earned." Jake swallowed hard. He understood what she was saying, but the weight of it still felt like a heavy burden. The promise he had made was just the beginning. "What do I need to do now?" he asked, his voice steady but full of anticipation. Helena remained silent for a moment, then spoke. "Now you must stand with us, not as an outsider, but as one of us. You will live with us, learn from us, and prove that you are willing to protect us, to honor the bond that has been created. This is the final part of the trial." Jake felt the ground shift beneath him. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing: he was no longer just a cowboy. He was part of something bigger, something that required more than just his presence. It required his heart, his commitment, and his willingness to change. Helena's eyes softened as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "The path you walk now is not an easy one," she said. "But it is the path of honor, and you must walk it with courage. If you do, you will truly become one of us." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him like a cloak. He had come here looking for something he couldn't quite name, but now he understood that what he was searching for wasn't just redemption or peace. It was belonging. And that was a far more complicated thing to find. Helena turned and walked toward the fire, her silhouette outlined against the night sky. Jake stood there for a moment, taking in the vastness of the desert around him. The stars above seemed endless, stretching out into infinity, and for the first time since he had arrived, Jake felt a sense of calm. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this: he had made a choice. And that choice had brought him to a place where he could finally begin to understand what it meant to be truly free. He followed Helena toward the fire, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the bond between them had already begun to change him. And there, in the flickering glow of the flames, he took the first step toward a new life, one he had never imagined but was now ready to embrace. The days that followed were a blur of new beginnings and silent realizations for Jake. Nehemina had spoken of walking a path of honor, of proving his loyalty to the Apache people, and though he had made his choice, the weight of what he had to do next never left him. He could feel it in the air, the quiet expectation, the subtle tension that hung between him and Nehemina. As the days passed, the camp began to feel more like home. The people, though distant at first, started to accept him as one of their own. He worked beside them, learning their ways, listening to their stories, and beginning to understand the depth of the bond he had promised to protect. Nehemina was always nearby, her watchful eyes never far from his, and yet there was an unspoken understanding between them now. She had given him the chance to prove himself, and he was doing just that. The fire that had once felt so foreign to him, so intimidating, was now a place where he could sit in silence, listening to the elders share their wisdom. It was in these moments that Jake realized just how much he had missed, the connection to something greater than himself. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Nehemina approached him as he sat alone by the fire. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw a softness in them, a warmth that had been absent since their first meeting. "You have done well," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Jake looked up at her, unsure of what to say. He had done what he could, but part of him still wondered if it was enough. "I don't know if I'm enough," he admitted quietly. Nehemina sat beside him, the firelight casting shadows across her face. "You are," she said simply. "You have already proven your loyalty to us in ways that words could never express. But there is still more for you to learn, Jake. There is more for all of us to learn." Jake nodded slowly, taking in her words. He knew she was right. This journey wasn't just about fulfilling a promise. It was about understanding what it meant to belong, to protect, to be part of something greater than himself. As the weeks passed, Jake's role in the tribe grew stronger. He no longer felt like an outsider, but a true part of the Apache people. The bond between him and Nehemina deepened, not through grand gestures, but through shared moments, working side by side, sitting in silence by the fire, and speaking in a language that had no words. One day, as they stood together on a hill overlooking the valley, Nehemina turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "There is something you must understand, Jake," she said, her voice steady but full of meaning. "Our bond, the one you have pledged to protect, is not just between you and me. It is a bond between our people, between the past and the future. You have become a part of that." Jake felt a sense of pride swell in his chest at her words. He had come here searching for something, redemption, belonging, peace, but what he had found was far more than he had ever imagined. It was a sense of purpose, a connection to something ancient, something that transcended time and place. He looked at Nehemina, his eyes filled with a new understanding. "I understand," he said quietly. Nehemina smiled, and for the first time, Jake felt the full weight of their bond, the promise, the trust, the responsibility, all of it wrapped up in a single moment. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Jake knew his life would never be the same. He had stepped onto a path he could never turn away from, and with each step, he became more connected to the Apache people, more connected to Nehemina, and to the land itself. His past was no longer something to escape from, it was a part of him, woven into the fabric of the life he was building. The trial, as Nehemina had called it, was over, but the journey was far from finished. The promise he had made was not just a promise to Nehemina, it was a promise to the land, to the people, and to himself. And as he stood by the fire that night, with Nehemina by his side, he knew that the bond they had forged would last forever.